So, lots of technology, lots of potential for this still to go wrong, I'm sure. My name is Jonathan Dawes. I work at the University of Bath, and I'm an applied mathematician. I got interested in this issue of the Sustainable Development Goals, and so I wanted to tell you a little bit about an approach that I've taken recently. It is a kind of theory rather than a data-driven approach. So I have kind of three sort of things for you to hold on to through the talk. One is, it's very much the first attempt. It's not the final word. There will be plenty more of this, and a lot more data-driven versions of this over the next 13 years or so. And really this is more about how we think about the Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular the interactions between them, than it is about any single goal or about, in a sense, anything to do with the ambition of the goals themselves. So let's see how we get on. So I've got one particular kind of underlying report here, which was produced a couple of years ago jointly by the International Council for Science and the International Social Science Council. They're now merging to be one International Council for Science, so I'm sure there will be, and there's already some follow-up work by them on this, and I'll briefly go into the methodology, but that's not really the point in a way. But what it does do is it gives you a very simple model that then has some dynamics that one can interpret in terms of where we might be going for Agenda 2030, and it enables you to do some sort of, to be selective. The laser. This one? All right, I was using the other one. So I'll just wave my hands around more. So there's a model, and if you have a toy model of something, then you can play with it. So I've enjoyed playing with it, and I'll give you kind of two versions of that. So just to kind of rewind slightly to the Millennium Development Goals, there was a statement in the sort of the review of the MDGs in 2015 pointing out the need to integrate gender perspectives, and this ambition, in a sense, points to some of perhaps the deficiencies in how the Millennium Development Goal program was then carried forward. That achievements on different MDGs were differently successful, and some of the more obvious successes were around nutrition and poverty rather than maybe around gender ambitions. Nevertheless, the global community has decided to broadly increase the ambition of its agenda, and so we have the follow-on Sustainable Development Goals with this collection of 17 categories. In the MDGs, gender equality got its own goal, and it still has, obviously, in the SDGs as well, Goal 5. So there's a very complicated collection here of 17 goals, 169 individual targets sitting underneath those, and then various means of implementation targets that in this presentation I will ignore entirely. And indeed, I'm going to ignore Goal 17, the partnership, as well, and just focus on 1 to 16. And the way that these then form some kind of system of interacting ambitions. And so what I've done here is just to give you the two-letter shortened versions that I'm going to use on various slides subsequently for the goals to label things. And in brackets, you have the number of targets for each of those goals. So it gives you some sense of the granularity sitting behind this collection of goals 1 to 16 and those 107 individual targets. So then there are a number of very immediate questions. What are the consequences of setting so many targets? How do these sort of goals depend on each other? Are they entirely independent ambitions, or actually are there some sense of this is the reverse would be to think about this as a set of dominoes, and there's some way of lining up the SDGs in order, and if you find the one that's first in the queue and you make that one fall over, then actually everything else follows. Wouldn't that be lovely? Okay, because that would reduce it to essentially one goal rather than 16. So is that the case, or are we, as you might expect, somewhere between those two models? So either you have 16 individual dominoes you have to push over one by one, or they're all lined up and you have one to push, and then they all fall over. Okay? Which is it? And so which goals are easier to achieve and which are harder to achieve? So very shortly after the goals were put together, ICSU and ISSC together put this report together discussing, from a science perspective, I should point out, this essentially what this collection of targets and goals was. And it's really quite critical as a report, but it offers some useful insights into these connectivities between the goals. And it's those connectivities that I've been looking at. So just so that you don't have to read the report in its entirety, maybe, this is a summary of the recommendations. So they're an improvement. There's no overall goal binding them together. There's no sense of who will actually drive what. Trade-offs and complementarities are not specified, so that's important for this talk. And actually quite a lot of the targets as written need considerably more work to make them actually kind of measurable and achievable. So on this talk, I'm going to focus on this question: what are the interlinkages between these goals? And the UN Department for Economic Research has done some sort of discussion of this, and so they've pulled together some pictures like this that I find very hard to make head or tail of. This is in a report that I'd be happy to send anybody. So gender is there, for example, and looks pretty central. Poverty is over here, okay, in this particular representation, but it's quite hard to distill anything out of that. Here is the same picture essentially turned on its side to fit onto the page. Poverty, you'll now notice, makes it to the middle, okay, and gender is kind of top right. So what is interesting is that in some of the narrative that comes out of the UN about this are statements like this. So progress on poverty eradication is central to the other goals. So there's a sort of question here about how we understand and interpret this system that we're given. So the methodology that I've taken is to go back through this report from ICSU and ISSC, where actually they do make some detailed statements about the linkages between different goals and which targets in another goal are actually impacted by progress on the goal that you first thought of. So to give you an example, there's a statement in the sort of linkages table for SDG 5 on gender equality that women's involvement in economic growth is central given their roles in both waged employment and unwaged work. So that's an indication that goal 5 links to goal 8. And it does this in a more specific way because it actually then picks out these 4 parts of goal 8 that are facilitated by goal 5. So the economic growth goal 8 has 10 targets, okay, and they've picked out 4 of them here. And there's a directionality to it. So it says that if you make progress on goal 5, then you will make progress, which way around is it here? Yeah, if you make progress on goal 5, then you'll make progress on goal 8, okay, in this sort of weighted sense that you will hit 4 out of the 10 targets in goal 8. So you can repeat this through the whole report, and I'm now going to give you 2 color-coded pictures that are quite hard to interpret. Then I'm going to put them together in another color-coded picture that is also hard to interpret. Okay, so let's see how we get on. So the basic idea is with this matrix, that I've got goals that I've labeled I, 1 to 16 on the left, so that labels the rows, and I'm labeling the columns by an index J. And then the idea is that goal J has some positive or negative influence on goal I. So this is reading the report sort of in 2 stages. First of all, constructing this matrix row by row. So if I go down to the row by row, then I see that goals 1, 2, and 3, the authors of those parts of the report suggested that progress on pretty much every one of the 16 goals would make positive progress on goals 1, 2, and 3, which are poverty, hunger, and health. Okay? If we then go down to row 5, when you look at the authors who are responsible for that chapter in the report, they indicated that progress on goals 9 and 10 would positively impact progress on goal 5. Okay, so that's the inequality and the industrial growth goal, industrial development. So that's a table built up row by row. There's a similar set of data, which is also in the report, which I now want you to think of as being built up column by column. So instead of looking at the effects on a particular goal from everything else, think about what progress on that goal would drive. Okay, so this is the kind of the out degree version rather than the in degree version. So looking at gender equality goal 5, you see that if you made progress towards gender equality, that would drive progress on goal 16, on goal 13, climate change, 12, 11, and so on, and many others. And then particularly strongly on goals 4, 3, 2, and 1. Okay, so education, health, poverty, and hunger. So this is the underlying data source, okay, and it's assembled in some kind of semi-quantitative method, as I very briefly described. And one can then just superimpose those two pictures and get some sense of the complete interaction matrix. Okay, so this is a collection of interactions between Sustainable Development Goals 1 to 16 and how they influence progress on the other goals. So you have a network problem, you have all these interactions, almost all these interactions are positive, indicated by the green through to yellow, lighter colors, and a very few of them are negative, okay, indicated by the darker blue colors. So this then gives you some modeling assumption that you can work with. I think my time is probably getting very limited, but you can then sort of deduce what you would expect out of this whole system of interactions. So my point here is that goal 5 does not sit on its own, but it both influences other goals and it's influenced by other goals. So in order to understand the role of one particular goal, one really should look at the entire network system. This is picking out some of those highest value edges where there are little kind of reinforcing loops. So there's something particularly noteworthy if you have kind of mutual beneficial interactions where you're likely to drive progress that drives progress on another goal that reinforces what you already had. So a little virtuous circle. So there are a small number of virtuous circles here indicated by the blue arrows, and then there are some red arrows with a kind of circle head that indicate the strongest negative interactions. Okay, there are plenty more interactions, of course, but here are just some of the highest weighted ones. And then one can put that into a small mathematical model. This is an incredibly simple thing that is open to all kinds of discussion. And think about growing forward from 2015 up to 15 years in to 2030. What would progress on each of those goals look like if we equally invested our direct effort in progress equally across all 16 goals? Okay, then we would have growth on most of them, progress towards achieving that target, going from 0 to 1 in some scale, and then we massively overachieve in poverty, hunger, and health, the top 3 lines, and actually we fail to get towards the goal in terms of our terrestrial ecosystem and our oceans in this picture. So we can summarize that another way, just looking at the final states. So this is goal by goal. Do we make all the progress, 1, that we expected, or do we make vastly more, or do we make vastly less? And so we achieve progress on every goal except on the oceans goal, it looks like, because the oceans goal is negatively impacted by agricultural developments and the use of fertilizers, for example, in the commentary from ICSU. But this is perhaps more interesting. So this is really the last slide with any content, where this is a sense of trying to optimize the whole system by reallocating my direct effort in an unequal fashion, by saying that actually I have some of these goals stacked up as dominoes, and I know that if I make significant progress on some of the goals, then I will reinforce progress on others. So actually I can be less directly invested in some of those downstream goals, and I can focus my attention on the upstream goals. Okay, so which goals are downstream and which ones are upstream? And this tells you that. So this really says if you're downstream, you're lower down the figure. If you're upstream, you're higher up. Okay, so I need to directly invest myself more in, where are we? Education and gender equality, okay, goals 4 and 5, and also in growth and industry. But I don't need to be so directly invested in poverty, health, and hunger because they are downstream, because the other actions that we would take to solve some of those slightly higher order sustainable development goals would enable progress on those goals 1 to 3. Okay, so here is a sense of trying to pick apart this system and say that it's not quite the case that everything is connected to everything else in an equal fashion, but if I had to choose where to put my effort, this is where I would choose to put it. And I would need to pay particular attention to the oceans and the terrestrial ecosystem because they are, in a sense, most at risk through the economic growth goals. And actually, by doing that unequal investment of direct effort, we can do better. We can use the network interactions themselves to reinforce those investments and to give us a non-linear and slightly more rapidly increasing growth in the total progress that we make on every goal. So this is some measure of the network coupling, how strong you think those interactions are, and then compared to that dashed line, which is essentially no kind of coupling between any of the goals, the blue line gives you a sense of the extra gain that you would have by using the network coupling to your advantage. And I'll stop here. So this is just to summarize. If you think this is a network problem, then there are some parts that are upstream and some that are downstream. And you should then worry more about the upstream goals because they're less reinforced through the network dynamics. And gender equality is mutually enforced by progress on the peace goal, but it's definitely an upstream goal, and therefore it's worthy of direct investment. Okay? So those two in blue. And there's plenty more you can do here, and I would invite people to do it and to do this better than I have. Thank you.